Stop! Your Honor, you can't do this! This is wrong!
Who are you? Why are you interfering in court proceedings without my permission? This is unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it.
Your Honor, I have evidence that can prove this man is not guilty.
Then present your evidence to the court. If it is credible and admissible, the court will consider it before reaching a verdict.
An 18-year-old stranger walked into the court. Within minutes, his 20-year sentence was overturned. I love you, my beautiful family. God bless you. Let's start with Love Chapter 10. I have a surprise for you. Watch till the end. The staircase was supposed to take 5 days. That was the number Malachi Rowe gave the lodge owner over the phone, and Malachi Rowe was not a man who missed his numbers. He was young that summer, the finest apprentice carpenter in Knoxville, a man whose teacher liked to say he measured 3 times and cut once, and had never once handed back sloppy work. Careful. That was the word people reached for when they described him. Careful hands, careful eyes. Hold on to that word. Before another summer came around, a jury of strangers would be told that Malachi Rowe was reckless, and they would believe it, and it would cost him everything a man can lose while his heart is still beating. But none of that had happened yet. It was June of 2007, and he was just a carpenter driving up into the Smokies with a truck bed full of red oak, hired to build a curved staircase that 2 older men had already refused to attempt. The lodge on the parkway was full that week, every room taken. So on the first evening, with sawdust still clinging to his forearms, Malachi drove up the road above the parkway to a small white inn with a long porch and a sign that said Hartwell Inn in letters repainted so many times they had grown soft at the edges. The young woman behind the front desk was Maren Hartwell, and she looked up from the ledger when the screen door banged. Afterward, neither of them could ever say what exactly happened in that first half-minute. Nothing happened. He asked for a room. She said they had one. He signed the ledger. That was all. But she wrote his name in blue ink, Malachi Rowe, and caught herself thinking it sounded like a name out of the Old Testament, a name that belonged to somebody older, somebody with a long story behind him. She had no way of knowing how long the story would be, or that she had just written the first line of it. She gave him the room at the end of the hall. He came back from the lodge the next evening smelling of oak shavings and varnish, and found that supper had been kept back for him, wrapped in foil, still warm. This was not something the Hartwell Inn did for guests. Her father noticed it, and being a wise man, said nothing. The second night they talked on the porch until midnight. The third night, later still. She told him about the inn, how her grandfather had built it with war money and pure stubbornness, how she knew every sound its bones made in the wind, how she could stand in the dark kitchen and tell you which stair a person was on. He told her about Knoxville, about his mother, gone a few years now, about the grandfather he had loved, and the land east of the city, and the construction company that carried the family name. "So, who runs it all now?" Maren asked. "My uncle, Otis." Malachi turned his coffee cup in his hands, careful even with a cup. "He holds it in the meantime." "In the meantime of what?" "Till I turn 25. Then it comes to me. My grandfather fixed it that way in his will. Otis manages it. I inherit it." Maren studied him in the porch light. "Does your uncle know you know that?" Malachi laughed, an easy laugh, a laugh with no fear anywhere in it. "Otis can read a will same as anybody. He said it the way a man says something harmless, and it should have been harmless. It was only paper, resting in a lawyer's drawer down in Knoxville, written in ink, perfectly legal. But some paper is patient. Some paper lies in a drawer like a snake in a woodpile, waiting for the one summer, the one road, the one night that lets it strike. That paper was already waiting. Nobody on the porch knew it yet. When the staircase was finished, the lodge owner walked up and down the curve of it twice with his hand trailing the rail and said it was the prettiest work he had ever paid for. The job was done. Malachi Rowe should have driven home that evening. Instead, he walked into the Hartwell Inn and paid cash for 2 more nights, and Maren Hartwell pretended badly to be surprised. The next day, she closed the desk early. She borrowed her father's truck and told Malachi there was something he had to see before he went back to the flatlands, and she would not tell him what it was, and she drove him up into the national park as the light went long and golden. She took him to Newfound Gap. High on the spine of the Smokies, where Tennessee touches North Carolina, the mountains fold away from the overlook in blue ranks until they stop looking like land at all. In the daytime, the place is crowded with tourists. Maren did not take him in the daytime. She took him at dusk and kept him there, leaning against the low stone wall, while the color drained west, and the cold, clean dark came up out of the valleys, and then the stars came out. At that height, the stars do not come out politely. They come out like something spilled. An older couple stood nearby with a camera, the kind you had to wind. Maren asked them for one picture. The old man took his time framing it. Malachi put his arm around her. The wind pushed her hair sideways. Just before the shutter clicked, the old man said something that made them both laugh, and that is the instant the camera caught. A young man in a grey work shirt, looking not at the lens, but at the girl beside him, and the girl looking dead into the camera, chin up, like she was daring the future to try something. The future heard her. The couple promised to mail the photograph to the inn, and weeks later, true to their word, they did. One frame, one envelope. Maren Hartwell would keep that envelope for 19 years in a cedar box, locked, opened only at night, only alone. But that comes later. On the mountain, in the dark, none of it had happened yet, and the two of them stood under that spilled sky a long time without talking, because at some point in that week, words had started to feel like small change. On the last night, they sat on the porch steps and circled the only thing left to say. He said it first. 1 month, Malachi told her. I've got a job to finish in Knoxville, and money to draw out of the bank, and one thing to buy. Then I'm coming back up this mountain. One thing to buy, Maren repeated. You know what it is? Say it anyway. A ring. He looked at her steadily, careful eyes, careful voice. I'm coming back with a ring, Maren, not with more words. I've given you a week of words, and words are cheap. I'm coming back with the thing itself, and I'll ask you proper, and you can decide then. She believed him instantly and completely. She would go on believing him through 19 years of silence, against all evidence, against her own family's gentle pleading, against every reasonable voice, including her own. She never once decided she had been wrong to believe him. She was not wrong. That was the tragedy. Every word he said on those steps was true. He meant to come back. He would spend 19 years trying. He left the next evening. Mark that. He meant to leave in the morning, in daylight, on a forgiving road. But the lodge owner asked him to come back and adjust 2 treads that had settled overnight. And Malachi Rowe did not leave work imperfect, not ever. So he spent the afternoon on his knees with a chisel making another man's staircase flawless. He ate a last supper Maren held back for him, and he pointed his pickup down the mountain after dark. His own carefulness put him on that road at night. Let that settle in. The very thing that made him good delivered him to the thing that would destroy him. Maren stood in the gravel lot and watched his tail lights until the curve took them, and then stood a while longer, memorizing the sound of his engine fading down toward the valley. 1 month, he had said. South of Knoxville, at that same hour, a roadhouse door swung open, and a young man walked out into the parking lot, weaving slightly, keys in his fist. He had been drinking since the middle of the afternoon. He got behind the wheel anyway, because he had been getting behind wheels drunk for years, and no consequence had ever once managed to find him. His father's name opened doors in that county. His father's name closed files. His name was Wade Slocum. And down out of the mountains, onto Chapman Highway, the old 2-lane into South Knoxville, with the ridgeline pressing close and the dark lying on the road like water, came a careful man with a promise in his chest, like a lit lamp, most of the way home. Ahead of him, a pair of headlights swung wide across the center line. Malachi Rowe had 1 second, 2 bad choices, and 19 years to pay for what happened next. Chapter 2. Chapman Highway. Chapman Highway does not forgive at night. Old-timers in South Knoxville will tell you that road has been taking people since before the war. 2 lanes of patched asphalt running between the ridgeline and the creek bottoms, curves that arrive a half-second before their signs do, long black stretches where the only light is whatever you brought with you. Local men drive it with both hands and their radios low. Malachi Rowe drove it that way. Both hands. Radio off, in fact, because he was doing arithmetic in his head. Happy arithmetic, the price of a ring against the money in his account, and he wanted the quiet for it. He was most of the way home. He had a promise in his chest, like a lit lamp. Ahead of him, unseen, 2 other lives were converging on the same dark mile of road, and neither of them knew his name yet. The first belonged to Ollie Brumfield, an old retired machinist coming home from his sister's place in Seymour with a casserole dish on the seat beside him, driving his silver sedan the way he had driven all his life, slow and steady and dead center in his lane. Ollie Brumfield had never had an accident. He had grandchildren who adored him and a workshop full of birdhouses he built for the church bazaar, and on that June night he had less than 2 minutes left to live. The second life belonged to Wade Slocum. Wade had left the roadhouse well over the limit, and well over the speed limit too, headed south with the windows down and the radio loud, a truck he did not deserve under him, and a whole afternoon of drinking in his blood. He knew the road. That was the thing about Wade. He would say it for years afterward, in the small hours, to himself alone. He knew that road. Knowing it had never once required him to respect it. The curve came up on him faster than it ever had before. Physics does not check your father's name. Wade's truck drifted wide, the way a drunk man's truck drifts, gradually, almost gently, until his headlights were no longer in his lane at all. They were in the oncoming lane. They were in Malachi's lane. Malachi saw them swing across the center line and had 1 second. In that second, his careful mind did what careful minds do. It measured. Oncoming truck, left of center, closing fast. Shoulder to his right, narrow, guardrail beyond it. He braked hard and pulled right, giving the drunk man room to correct, giving him the whole road if he wanted it, and it almost worked. It would have worked. But Wade Slocum, surfacing too late from the fog of his own blood, wrenched his wheel back toward his own lane, overcorrected the way drunks do, and the tail of his truck swung out and caught the front left corner of Malachi's pickup. It was not a hard hit. That was the obscenity of it. It was a glancing blow, a kiss of metal on metal at highway speed, silver paint grinding onto blue steel. But on that road, in that dark, a glancing blow is a hand of God. It threw Malachi's truck left, across the center line he had fought to stay behind, into the southbound lane, into the headlights of Ollie Brumfield's silver sedan. Malachi stood on the brake, but there was no distance left to spend, and no time to spend it in, and the 2 vehicles met nearly head-on, with a sound that people in the nearest house, a good way off through the trees, described as one single, terrible clap. Then it was quiet. Wade Slocum's truck fishtailed, straightened, and did not stop. That must be said plainly and slowly, so that it lands the way it deserves to land. He did not stop. He watched his mirror shrink the wreckage down to a smudge of steam and darkness, and he drove on with his heart slamming and his mind already doing its own arithmetic, sober arithmetic, the fastest sobriety of his life. His truck was damaged. His breath was a crime. His father was a county commissioner. Wade did not drive home. He pulled into a gas station lot, hands shaking, and made one phone call. Not to the police, to his father's after-hours line. Del Slocum listened to his son without interrupting. Then he said, "Where is the truck?" And, "Have you talked to anyone?" And, "You will not talk to anyone." And before the night was out, Wade's truck was sitting inside a closed body shop that owed the county money, and the county, in ways that would take 19 years to surface, was beginning to owe the body shop. Back on Chapman Highway, Malachi Rowe came to with his forehead against the wheel and blood in his mouth, and dragged himself out of his ruined truck and limped through the glass to the silver sedan. He held Ollie Brumfield's hand while the old man died. That fact never made it into any report. Malachi told it to no one for years because there was no one who would believe he had the right to grieve. But he was there, kneeling in the broken glass with a stranger's hand in his, saying, "Help is coming, sir. Help is coming." And he was still there, still kneeling, when the first blue lights topped the ridge. Trooper Buford Hatch had worked Chapman Highway for over a decade. He had seen every kind of wreck the road knew how to produce, and he read crash scenes the way other men read scripture, closely, humbly, expecting the truth to live in the details. He walked the scene with his flashlight and his field notebook while the ambulance crew worked, and what he found, he wrote down, in a hand as neat as a schoolteacher's. He found 2 sets of tire marks. One, a long, straight scar of hard braking, laid down by the blue pickup in its own northbound lane before it ever crossed over. The other, shorter, scuffed and yawing near the curve in the southbound lane, the signature of a vehicle swerving and correcting at speed. 2 vehicles had lost control on that road. Only one of them was present. He found the front left corner of Malachi's blue pickup crushed in a way the collision with the sedan could not explain, an impact from the wrong side, at the wrong angle. And ground into that crumpled blue steel, he found paint, silver paint. The sedan was silver, too, and a lazier man would have shrugged the whole question away right there. Buford Hatch was not a lazy man. He noted in his book that the transfer on the front left corner sat too high and too far back to have come from the sedan, that the smear ran the wrong direction, and that in his judgment the paint should go to the state lab for comparison. He wrote the words possible second vehicle and underlined them, and then wrote them again on the evidence tag. Then he did his job all the way. He walked to the young man sitting on the guardrail with a blanket around his shoulders and blood drying on his face and asked him what happened. "There was another car," Malachi said. "A truck. He came across the line at me. He clipped me and pushed me over. There was another car." Hatch wrote it down. He also called for a blood draw on the surviving driver, standard in a fatality, and the hospital took Malachi's blood in the small hours of the morning, and the result came back in due course, reading 0. Stone sober. A sober, careful man, most of the way home to a ring. Here is where the story stops being about a road and starts being about paper. Trooper Hatch turned in his field notes, his measurements, his evidence tags, his request for the paint analysis, and his written summary containing the words possible second vehicle. He turned them into men above him, men who worked in offices where Del Slocum's name had weight, and he went home believing, as he had believed his whole career, that the truth he collected would become the truth on file. The report that emerged from those offices some weeks later described one vehicle crossing the center line. It contained 1 set of tire marks. It mentioned no paint transfer, requested no comparison, and quoted a driver whose story about a phantom truck was noted and dismissed. Where Hatch had written possible second vehicle, the file now said no evidence of other involved vehicles. The first lie had been put on paper. It was typed, stamped, and perfectly formatted, and it would outlive Ollie Brumfield's funeral, outlive Hatch's protests, outlive the promises of that summer, and very nearly outlive the truth itself. Days later, in a hospital corridor smelling of antiseptic, 2 Knox County detectives told Malachi Rowe he was being charged with vehicular homicide. He asked about the other truck. He asked about the paint on his fender. He asked them politely, carefully, the way he asked everything, to please just look at the front left corner of his pickup. By then, no one could. The pickup had been released from the impound lot on a signature nobody would later be able to explain, and sold for scrap and crushed. And 90 minutes east, on a mountain, a young woman stood on the porch of a small inn every evening at dusk, watching the road. 1 month, he had said. The month had a few days left in it. Chapter 3. The Family's Price. Otis Rowe heard about the crash on a Tuesday morning, standing in the office of Rowe Land and Building Company with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. His first feeling, and this should be recorded honestly, was fear for his nephew. Otis was not born a monster. Monsters rarely are. He was a man past 50 who had spent the years since his father's death running the family company, growing it, sweating for it, signing its checks and walking its sites, and privately, quietly, coming to think of it as his. It was not his. That was the splinter under everything. The will sat in a drawer at a law office on Gay Street, and Otis had read it so many times he could recite it. The land east of the city, acre after rolling acre of it, and the company built on its edge, were held in trust. Otis managed both. And on the day Malachi Rowe turned 25, all of it, every acre and every truck and every contract, passed to Malachi, the grandson the old man had loved best, the boy with the careful hands. There was one exception, one clause, written in by a cautious old man who had buried too many kin gone wrong. If the grandson were ever convicted of a felony, the trust reversed. Everything went to Otis, permanently, free and clear. Otis had read that clause 100 times, the way a man reads a lottery ticket he knows will never hit. On that Tuesday morning, with the phone still warm in his hand, Otis Rowe did the math a beat faster than his conscience could get its boots on. His nephew was young, the birthday was years away yet, and his nephew had just been charged with a felony that could swallow decades. He put down the coffee. He told himself he was going to help. He hired Malachi, a lawyer, that same week, and this is important because it is the kind of detail that let Otis sleep. He paid for the defense. He visited the jail. He said the right words through the glass. "We'll fight this, son. Your granddad's watching over you." A wicked man could not have done these things, Otis reasoned, and so he could not be a wicked man. The lawyer he hired was named Gene Palmatier, amiable, tired, an old workhorse carrying more open files than any man could honestly serve, with a reputation for pleading cases out rather than trying them. Knoxville had a dozen younger, hungrier attorneys who would have torn the state's crash report apart. Otis knew their names. He hired Gene Palmatier. Then the second phone call came, and everything that was still an accident stopped being one. It came from a man who worked for Commissioner Del Slocum, a smooth, unhurried voice that never once said anything illegal. The voice said the commissioner was aware the Rowe family was going through a hard time. The voice said the commissioner believed the crash investigation was straightforward, one vehicle, one tragic error, and that it would be a shame for anyone to complicate a grieving process with wild theories about phantom trucks. The voice said the commissioner valued families who understood how the county worked, and that the county had a long memory for its friends. Rowe Land and Building bid on county contracts every year. The voice never mentioned Wade. It never had to. Otis had heard, the way men like Otis hear things, that the commissioner's boy had come home late that same night, and that his truck had gone into a shop, and Otis sat with the phone against his ear and understood with perfect clarity what he was being offered. Silence, in exchange for everything. He would tell himself, for 19 years, that he never actually decided, that he simply failed to object, that he only stopped asking questions, stopped pushing the lawyer, stopped mentioning the paint his nephew kept talking about, as if a man standing by a drowning boy holding the rope behind his back has decided nothing. But paper does not care what men tell themselves, and the paper of that autumn tells its own story. In September, the case file was quietly completed without the state lab ever receiving a paint sample. The evidence tag Trooper Hatch had written was logged, then marked administratively closed. Hatch filed a memorandum objecting. The memorandum went into a drawer, and that winter, Hatch himself was transferred to a desk assignment in a county half a day's drive away, for reasons described as staffing needs. In October, a supplemental forensic report, the one document that still described the crush damage on the pickup's front left corner and the foreign paint embedded in it, was reviewed by the prosecution and never served on the defense. Jean Palmetier, buried under his mountain of files, never knew it existed and never asked. And in the last days before trial, 2 cashier's checks were drawn on the account of Rowe Land and Building Company, signed by Otis Rowe. One to Pernell Cobb, a man who had been at the roadhouse that night. One to Letty Grimes, who lived in the last house before the curve. Generous checks, identical, and the memo lines on both said, "Consulting." At trial, in the spring of 2008, Pernell Cobb testified that he had left the roadhouse just before closing and driven that same stretch of Chapman Highway and seen one vehicle, the blue pickup, moving fast and loose. Letty Grimes testified that she heard one impact and, looking out, saw one set of headlights before the crash, not two. 2 witnesses, one story. No paint, no second set of tire marks. No field notebook, because the trial worked from the official report, and the official report was clean as a shroud. Malachi Rowe took the stand in a suit his uncle bought him and told the truth, carefully, exactly, the same way he had told it on the guardrail with blood on his face. A truck came across the line. It clipped him. It pushed him over. He was sober. The blood test proved he was sober, and he braked so hard trying to stay in his lane that the road still carried the scar of it. The prosecutor asked him where this truck was then, asked why no one else had seen it, asked the jury to notice that the defendant's story required a ghost, and that the dead man in the silver sedan was no ghost at all. The jury deliberated less than an afternoon, guilty of vehicular homicide. At sentencing, the judge spoke about the preciousness of Ollie Broomfield's life, which was true, and about the defendant's refusal to accept responsibility, which was the truth turned exactly inside out, and gave Malachi Rowe 20 years. He gripped the defense table when they read it, because his legs had stopped being his, and he looked back once at the gallery, at his uncle Otis, sitting a few rows back with his hat in his hands and his eyes down. Otis wept in the courthouse parking lot. That is true, and it is worth exactly nothing. Barely more than a year later, on the day Malachi turned 25 inside the Morgan County Correctional Complex, the trust reversed, and the land and the company and every truck and contract passed permanently to Otis Rowe, and he did not give any of it back, and the weeping stopped. One thing remains to be told about that year, and it is the cruelest thing. From the county jail, and then from prison, Malachi wrote to Gatlinburg. He wrote in pencil, pages at a time, to Maren Hartwell at the Hartwell Inn. He explained the crash, the charge, the lie of it. He begged her not to wait if waiting was too heavy, and begged her in the next line to wait. Letter after letter, through that whole first stretch of his sentence. He had no stamps of his own at first, and prison mail moves through hands. His uncle, visiting warm as ever through the glass, offered to handle his mail, carry the letters out, post them properly. Family looks after family. Otis drove home with the letters on the passenger seat. He read the first one at a red light, and understood that a woman in Gatlinburg was a loose thread, a person who believed in the phantom truck because Malachi had no reason on earth to lie to her, a person who might make noise for decades. The commissioner's smooth voice had said it plainly. It would be a shame for anyone to complicate things. The letters went into a metal box in Otis Rowe's garage, all of them. Then the ones that came after, season upon season, for 2 more years, until Malachi, receiving nothing back, not one line, finally believed the only thing left to believe, that the week on the mountain had been a week, nothing more, and that she had decided, and that he had no right to blame her. He stopped writing. Something in him closed like a door in winter. And at the Hartwell Inn, 90 minutes east, Maren stood on the porch at dusk past the end of the month, past the end of summer, past the first snow on the high ridges, watching the road with a secret rounding under her apron. By Christmas she could no longer hide it, and did not want to. In the spring, in a hospital room in Sevierville, she was holding a daughter with careful eyes. She named her Delia. Chapter 4. The Question That Built. Her every prison has a man like Malachi Rowe, and no one ever writes about him. Not the schemer, not the preacher, not the dangerous one. The quiet one. The one who fixes things. At the Morgan County Correctional Complex, an hour or so northwest of Knoxville, the chapel pews had been coming apart for a decade, joints loose, seats cracked, until a soft-spoken inmate from the carpentry detail asked the chaplain for permission to repair them. He rebuilt every pew in that chapel across 2 patient years, without one power tool, working wood the way monks work prayers. Then he repaired the library shelving, then the visiting room chairs, which he sanded and refinished, though he himself, by then, received no visitors at all. Otis came for years, then less, then rarely, then the visits became money on the commissary account, then the money became a Christmas card, then nothing. Otis had a company to run. It was a very good company now. Twice Malachi fought. Not with fists, with paper, because paper was what had buried him, and he believed in the early years that paper could dig him out. His appeal was denied. Then, years later, a post-conviction petition, put together with the help of a jailhouse legal aid, was denied without so much as a hearing. He had been sure about that one. He had let himself be sure. When the denial came, he did not speak for a week, and did not eat for longer, and the chaplain, who found him grey-faced in the woodshop staring at nothing, understood that hope, at a certain dosage, is a poison. Malachi survived it by deciding, deliberately, the way he measured a cut, never to take that poison again. He had a release date, still far off in the distance of a coming decade. He would build toward it quietly, pew by pew, year by year, and want nothing, and expect nothing, and that way nothing could ever again be taken from him, because a man who holds nothing cannot be robbed. He was wrong about that. He was still holding one thing. He just kept it where he never had to look at it, the memory of a girl leaning against a stone wall under a spilled sky. And it will matter at the end of this story that he never quite managed to put it down. 90 minutes east, at the Hartwell Inn, another person was learning to live around an absence. Delia Hartwell grew up in a house full of guests and one locked box. The cedar box sat on the top shelf of her mother's closet, and it was the only locked thing in the whole trusting inn, where room keys hung on open hooks and the cash drawer closed with a rubber band. Delia noticed it the way children notice everything adults think is hidden. She asked about her father for the first time, when she was small enough to ask it loudly, at the inn's long breakfast table, in front of guests. Her mother's face did something complicated and brief, and the answer was, "He had to go away, sweet pea," and the subject changed with the coffee pot. She asked again in the years after, and again, and the door closed gently every time, and every time, something in Delia turned the pressure of that closed door into fuel. At 11, she stopped asking and started investigating. She waited for a Saturday when her mother drove to Sevierville for supplies, stood on a chair in the closet, and worked the little lock on the cedar box with a bent paper clip and a patience that should have frightened somebody. Inside, she found a photograph. A young man in a grey work shirt with his arm around a young woman who was unmistakably her mother, both of them laughing, mountains behind them dissolving into a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled sugar. The man was not looking at the camera. He was looking at her mother. Delia stood on the chair and stared at his face, at his jaw, and understood 2 things at once, wordlessly, the way children understand lightning. That this was her father, and that he had not simply left, because nobody looks at a woman like that and then simply leaves. There was one more thing in the box, under the photograph. An envelope, postmarked, addressed to the inn in a stranger's elderly handwriting. Empty now, except for the photograph it had once delivered. No name, no return address that meant anything to a child. She put it all back exactly as she found it, clicked the lock, moved the chair, and told her mother nothing, ever. She was her father's daughter in ways neither of them knew. She could hold a thing steady and wait and keep her own counsel for as long as the work required. But that night at supper, she looked at Maren across the table, at this woman who ran an inn alone and laughed with guests and watched the road at dusk when she thought no one saw her. And Delia thought, with a clarity that changed the entire architecture of her life, "You won't tell me? Fine. Then I will become someone who can find out anything." Teachers noticed it that same year, though they misread the cause. The Hartwell girl did not learn like other children. She consumed. She finished 2 grades in the time built for one, and the school, half proud and half unnerved, moved her up and then moved her up again. She read court cases for pleasure as a young teenager, actual case reporters from the library in Sevierville, following the paper trails of strangers' lives the way other girls followed music. Her mother watched all of it with pride and a private, growing dread, because Maren Hartwell was no fool, and she knew exactly what kind of engine was driving her daughter, and she knew where engines like that eventually drive. Delia finished high school at 13. She entered the University of Tennessee that same fall through its early admission program, the youngest student on a campus of tens of thousands, a girl who ate lunch alone with casebooks and did not mind. Stacking summer terms and overloaded semesters, she finished her bachelor's degree in 2 years. The College of Law took her that August at 15 on the strength of a personal essay whose topic the admissions dean later admitted none of them could forget. The essay was about wrongful convictions. It ended with a sentence the dean quoted for years. "Somewhere there is a truth with no one assigned to it, and I would like the job." She earned her law degree through an accelerated program, graduating in the spring of 2025, 17 years old, first in her class. At the ceremony in Thompson Bowling Arena, each graduate's family stood as their name was called. When the dean read Delia Hartwell, one woman stood alone in the crowd, clapping with both hands raised, and Delia, crossing the stage, looked at her mother and at the empty seat beside her mother, and smiled for the cameras anyway. She had gotten very good at that particular smile. She sat for the Tennessee bar exam the following winter. Tennessee sets no minimum age for admission, only mountains of requirements, and she had climbed every one. The results posted in the spring. She passed with one of the highest scores in the state. The swearing-in was held at the Supreme Court building in Knoxville on a bright morning in late April of 2026, days after her 18th birthday. A local news crew came because the Board of Law Examiners had confirmed what the reporters suspected. At 18 years and 11 days old, Delia Hartwell was the youngest person ever licensed to practice law in the history of the state of Tennessee. She stood in a navy suit, bought in Sevierville, raised her right hand, and swore to support the constitutions of the United States and of Tennessee, and the camera caught her face, calm and certain, a face the whole region would see again on their screens within the year, though nobody knew that yet. The camera also caught, without understanding it, a woman in the second row who wept through the entire oath. The reporters assumed the tears were pride, and they were. But they were not only that. Maren Hartwell sat watching her daughter swear allegiance to the law and thought about a man who had trusted the law and been fed to it, though she still believed, after all these years, that he had simply chosen not to come back. 19 years of grief will braid itself around a lie until you cannot tell which strand is holding you up. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, the reporter asked the new attorney the question they always ask. Why law? Why so fast? Delia looked into the camera. Somewhere behind her eyes stood a child on a chair, holding a photograph of a man who was not looking at the camera. "Because some questions don't get answered," she said, "until you're the one allowed to ask them." The clip ran that evening across East Tennessee. It ran in Knoxville, in Sevierville, in Gatlinburg. It did not run in the Morgan County Correctional Complex, where a gray-templed man in the woodshop was planing a cabinet door, less than 2 years from his release date, wanting nothing, expecting nothing, holding nothing, except the one thing. Chapter 5. The Photograph in the File. The Tennessee Conviction Review Project occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building on Market Square in Knoxville, above a coffee shop and below a yoga studio, and its entire archive of human catastrophe fit into a row of grey filing cabinets against the back wall. Faye Ridgway ran it, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, a woman who had spent her whole working life watching the machinery of justice from the inside and had stepped down from a judgeship to spend her remaining energy prying open its mistakes. She hired Delia Hartwell a few weeks after the swearing-in, and she was honest about her reasons. "Half of it is that you're brilliant," Faye said across her desk. "The other half is that when your name is on a filing, clerks read it twice and reporters return my calls. Youngest lawyer in state history. I intend to spend that fame on people who have none. Does that offend you?" "No, ma'am," Delia said. "Spend all of it." The project had a couple of active cases and no money, which meant the new attorney's first weeks were unglamorous. Faye pointed her at the grey cabinets. "Closed files, cases we screened over the years and couldn't take or lost or ran out of funding for. Every new lawyer here reads the cabinets. It teaches you what a wrongful conviction actually looks like on paper, which is nothing like the movies. It looks boring. It looks correct. That's how it survives." Faye tapped the nearest cabinet with one knuckle. "Learn to smell it through the folder." So Delia read. Through May and into June, she stayed late with the cabinets, folder after folder, and Faye Ridgway would go home at supper time and leave the youngest attorney in Tennessee history alone with the hum of the mini-fridge and other people's ruined lives. On a Thursday evening in June, her fingers walked across a file thicker than its neighbors, a faded expansion folder with a typed label. State versus Roe, Malachi, Knox County, vehicular homicide, screened and declined, lack of funding. She pulled it for 2 reasons she would later recite to a courtroom, and both were true, and neither was the real one, because the real one had not happened yet. It was local, Knox County, road she knew, and it was thick, which meant somebody, at some point, had fought. She carried it to her desk, opened the folder, and began, as she always began, with the face. Every file started with the booking photograph. Faye had taught her that. Look at them first, before the paperwork tells you what to think. Delia Hartwell looked at the booking photograph of Malachi Rowe, taken on a June night in 2007, and the second floor of the narrow brick building went absolutely silent, as if someone had lifted the whole room out of the world. A young black man looked back at her, blood dried at his hairline, eyes stunned and careful. She knew that face, not the way you know a stranger who resembles someone. She knew it the way you know a face you have studied in secret one single time for 10 complete minutes, at 11 years old, standing on a chair in a closet, holding your breath and a photograph of a man in a grey work shirt who was not looking at the camera. Same jaw, same brow, same careful eyes, which she had spent the years since telling herself she remembered wrong. Her hands did not shake. That detail matters because it tells you what she was. A softer person would have trembled, wept, called her mother. Delia Hartwell sat perfectly still for a long moment while her heart went off like something detonating in a building marked for demolition, and then her mind, the engine her whole life had built, engaged. Verify. Nothing is true because it feels true. Verify. She turned to the arrest report. Date of offense, June of 2007. Location, Chapman Highway, South Knox County. Defendant residence, Knoxville. Occupation, carpenter's apprentice. Carpenter. She thought of the inn and her mother's voice years ago, watching a repairman rebuild the porch rail badly. You're a person I knew once could have done that joint in his sleep. The sentence had swallowed itself in the middle. Delia had noticed. Delia noticed everything. She had filed it away as a girl and carried it since. She read on. Convicted the following spring. Sentenced 20 years, Tennessee Department of Correction. Convicted in March. Delia sat back in the chair. Her own birthday was in April, 1 month later, 1 year after that mountain summer. She did the arithmetic no one had ever allowed her to do, the simplest arithmetic of her entire mathematical life, and it balanced on the first pass. A June on a mountain, an April in a delivery room, a man who had to go away, a locked box, a mother who watched the road at dusk, every dusk, for years, from a porch in Gatlinburg, 90 minutes from the courtroom where this man had been sentenced and who had never once, in all of Delia's life, spoken his name. She checked herself because that was her discipline. Coincidence was possible. The world held many carpenters and many jawlines. She required more than resemblance and arithmetic. The file gave it to her. Deep in the folder, in the intake questionnaire the project had mailed to the prisoner years back, in careful pencil handwriting that made letters like fine joinery, Malachi Rowe had answered the standard questions. Family who can be contacted in support of your case. The pencil had written, none. Uncle no longer in contact, and below it, the next question. Anyone else affected by your conviction whom we should know about? The pencil had pressed harder there. She could see it, the darker graphite, the two places where the point had stopped and started. There was a woman in Gatlinburg, Maren Hartwell, at the Hartwell Inn on the Parkway Road. I wrote to her for 2 years and she never answered, so I expect she has her reasons, and I ask that you not disturb her. But if it ever matters to anyone, what I was doing on that road, I was driving home to buy her a ring. Delia Hartwell read her mother's name in her father's handwriting, and the stillness finally broke. Not into tears, into motion. Because that was the sentence that ended all doubt, and it did more than that. It answered in a few pencil lines the question she had been asking since she was small enough to ask it loudly at a breakfast table. He had not left. He had been taken, and even from inside a cell, deep into a stolen sentence, his first instinct had been to protect her mother from the disturbance of the truth. I ask that you not disturb her. That was not a guilty man's sentence. That was a careful man's sentence. She read the entire file that night, every page, twice. She read the official crash report, 1 vehicle, 1 set of tire marks, no evidence of other involved vehicles. She read the trial summary, 2 eyewitnesses, a verdict reached before supper. She read the old screening memo in which some long-gone volunteer had scrawled in the margin, defendant's second vehicle claim, uncorroborated but oddly consistent across the years, blood test clean. Why did a sober carpenter cross the line? Worth a records pull we can't afford. Why did a sober carpenter cross the line? The question sat on the page like a live wire that had been lying in a drawer for years, waiting for someone with the training to pick it up. She looked up, and it was nearly midnight. Market Square stood empty below the windows. Somewhere, 90 minutes east, her mother was locking the inn's front door, and somewhere, an hour west, her father, and she made herself think the word for the first time. Her father was asleep in a cell less than 2 years from the end of a sentence for something the file itself did not quite believe he had done. 19 years, she thought. He asked them not to disturb her. She thought he never wrote. He thinks she never answered. 2 people 90 minutes apart, each politely dying of the other's silence, and I am the only person alive who is holding both ends of the wire. She thought about calling her mother. She stood there with the phone in her hand for a full minute. Then she set it down, and this must be understood, because everything that follows depends on it. It was not coldness. It was the opposite. If she called tonight, she would be handing her mother a cell number and a visiting schedule and a 19-year-old wound torn open with nothing to pour into it. Her mother did not need to know where he was. Her mother needed him back. And between those two things stood a closed case, a clean official report, a dead man's family who deserved the real truth, a county, a family named Slocum, a family named Rowe, and nearly 2 decades of settled paper that the entire machinery of the state considered finished business. Delia Hartwell looked at the row of grey cabinets, then at the folder on her desk, and felt the question that had built her whole life finally turn its face toward her and hold still. She took out her phone, laid the first page of the file flat under the desk lamp, and photographed it. Then the next page, then the next. It was long past midnight when she photographed the last one, and she never once, in all the hours between, sat down. Chapter 6. Paper Doesn't Lie. Faye Ridgway had taught her that wrongful convictions look correct on paper. She had not taught her the other half, because the other half cannot be taught, only found. They look correct on the paper that survives. The truth lives in the paper that went missing, and missing paper leaves a shape, the way a stolen painting leaves a brighter square on the wall. Delia Hartwell spent the last weeks of June hunting brighter squares. She began where any good lawyer begins, with a public records request, dry and routine, one of hundreds the Highway Patrol receives in a year. She asked for the complete investigative file on a fatal crash, Chapman Highway, June of 2007. She did not say who she was. She did not need to. The law makes the asking ordinary. The file arrived in a thick envelope, and she read it at her desk with the door closed, and it was exactly as clean as the trial had claimed. One vehicle, one driver, one set of tire marks, a closed circle of paper agreeing with itself, except for the evidence log. An evidence log is a humble thing, a ledger of tags, and clerks copy it without reading it. Halfway down the page, in the column for item description, someone had long ago written in a hand as neat as a schoolteacher's, paint transfer sample, front left corner, possible second vehicle, recommend lab comparison. And in the disposition column beside it, in different ink, a single entry, administratively closed. Delia read those 2 columns for a long time. The official report said no evidence of other involved vehicles. The official report's own evidence log said a trooper had tagged that evidence, named it, and asked for it to be tested. Somewhere between the tag and the report, a hand had reached into the file and taken the truth out of it, and the hand had missed the log, because hands like that always miss something. That is the entire faith of her profession, and she felt it settle over her that afternoon like a vow. The tag bore a badge number. The badge number had a name. The name had a pension, a mailing address, and a small house in the Cumberland County Hills, half a day west, where retired trooper Buford Hatch had been keeping bees and waiting, though he would not have called it waiting, for 19 years. She drove out on a Saturday. She had written ahead, 1 careful page, and he was on the porch when she pulled in, an old lawman gone grey and thick, standing the way troopers stand until the day they die. "You're the one from the news," he said. "The young one." "Yes, sir." "And you're here about the Rowe boy?" "Yes, sir." Hatch looked out at his bee-boxes for a moment. 19 years, he said. "I have been telling my wife somebody would come. She quit believing me around year 10. He held the screen door open. "I kept my notebooks, every year of my service. They're mine, bought with my own money, and no man in any office ever thought to ask for them. The notebook from that June night lay on his kitchen table before she had finished her first cup of coffee. He had found it the evening her letter came. It was all there, in that schoolteacher hand. The 2 sets of tire marks, measured and drawn. The crush damage on the wrong corner, at the wrong angle. The silver paint sitting too high and running the wrong way. The words possible second vehicle, underlined. The sober blood draw. And the sentence Malachi Rowe had said on the guardrail, taken down verbatim, there was another car, a truck. He came across the line at me. I filed a memorandum when the report came out wrong, Hatch said. I know what happened to it because the same thing happened to me. A desk, far away. He turned the notebook to face her. Take it. Photograph it. Do whatever the law lets you do with it. And when there's a courtroom, you call me, because I have been rehearsing for 19 years. She asked him, before she left, if he remembered who towed the pickup. He did. Old family outfit, South Side, the kind of business that never threw out a piece of paper in its life. He was right. The towing company's daughter, who ran the office now, walked Delia into a back room of file boxes going back generations, and in the box for that year was the intake sheet for a blue pickup, filled out at the yard the morning after the crash by a man noting condition on arrival, the way the insurance companies required. Front left corner damage, foreign paint transfer, silver. The sheet was carbon paper, faded to the color of weak tea, and it was beautiful. The truck itself was long gone, released and crushed on a signature no one could explain. But the truck had spoken once, to a tow yard clerk with a clipboard, and the carbon had listened. By the last day of June, she had the shape of it. The state's own log proving evidence was tagged and buried. A trooper's contemporaneous notebook, a tow yard's carbon sheet. 3 documents, born within days of the crash, all agreeing with the convicted man and disagreeing with his conviction. What she did not have was the question that had been sitting under all of it since the night in the office, patient as the cedar box itself. So on the first Sunday of July, she drove east into the mountains and pulled into the gravel lot of the Hartwell Inn in the late afternoon and found her mother in the kitchen shelling beans for the guests' supper. Well, look who remembered the way home, Maren said, smiling, and then she saw her daughter's face, and the smile went careful. What is it? Delia sat down across from her at the old table. She had cross-examined her first witness at an age when other girls were learning to drive, and she had never once, in any proceeding, been afraid of a question. She was afraid of this one. Mama, the man in the photograph in the cedar box, what was his name? The bowl of beans went absolutely still. It would have been kind to pretend, and her mother tried for perhaps 3 seconds. Then 19 years came down all at once, the way snow comes off a steep roof, and Maren Hartwell put both hands flat on the table as if the table might leave too. You went in the box. When I was 11. I never told you. Mama. His name. Maren looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she got up without a word and went up the stairs and came down with the cedar box and set it on the table between them and unlocked it with a little key she wore on a chain Delia had assumed her whole life held a spare for the front desk. She lifted out the photograph and looked at it the way you look at weather, and said the name out loud in that kitchen for the first time in Delia's entire life. Malachi Rowe. He built staircases. Her voice did not break, which was somehow worse. He was going to come back in 1 month with a ring, and he never came, and he never wrote, not one line, and I decided a long time ago that whatever his reason was, it was his, and I quit asking God about it. Delia held herself very still. He never wrote, she repeated. Not one letter. You're certain. Nothing ever came. Child, I met the mail every day for 2 years. I'd have known his hand without a return address. Nothing came. Maren's eyes narrowed because she was no fool, and her daughter's stillness was the stillness of a person holding something enormous. Why are you asking me this? Why now, Delia? What do you know? And here was the cruelest discipline of Delia Hartwell's young life, harder than any exam the state had ever set for her, because she knew where he was. She knew it to the building, to the wing, to the number of months remaining. She could have said it in 8 words and watched her mother's world crack open on this kitchen table, with nothing underneath to catch it, no verdict, no vindication, no him, just a location and a wound. Her mother did not need to know where he was. Her mother needed him back. I'm working an old case, Delia said, which was true. His name came up in it, which was true. I can't say more yet, which was the hardest true thing she had ever said. But Mama, I need you to hear one thing tonight, and I need you to hold on to it without asking me anything else. Can you do that? Maren, gripping the photograph, nodded once. He wrote, Delia said, for 2 years, letter after letter. I've seen proof of it in his own handwriting. They never reached you, and that was not his doing, and it was not yours. She drove back down the dark mountain that night with her mother's face in her mirror, and one question burning in the car with her, the question the beans and the box and the 2 years of watched mail had distilled to a point. The letters were written. The letters never arrived. Somewhere between a prison and a porch, somebody had taken them, and prison letters do not mail themselves. They pass through hands. On a legal pad on the passenger seat, at a red light in Sevierville, Delia wrote a single line and underlined it twice, the way a trooper had once underlined 4 words in a notebook. Who carried his mail? Chapter 7. Follow the money. The question rode home with her and slept badly. Who carried his mail? A prison logs what leaves through its mailroom, but a visitor who carries letters out by hand leaves no log, only a visiting record. And visiting records are paper, and paper was her country now. The visitation history arrived within the week, another routine request, another dry envelope. Delia spread the early years of it across her desk and read the story it told without meaning to tell anything. One name over and over through the first years of the sentence. The same name signed in the same confident hand, week upon week, then month upon month, then thinning like a winter creek, then gone. Otis Rowe, the uncle, the one the pencil handwriting on the intake form had dismissed in 3 words. Uncle no longer in contact. The only visitor Malachi Rowe ever had, present constantly through exactly the 2 years the letters were written, and vanishing not long after the letters stopped. It proved nothing by itself. She knew that. An uncle visiting a nephew is love on paper, not theft. But she had learned to smell it through the folder, and she sat with that visiting log for a long time, and then she went looking for the reason, because interception is labor, and nobody labors without a reason. She found the reason in the probate archive of the Knox County Courthouse, in a will that had been sitting in the public record for a 1/4 century, available to anyone with a case number and a quiet afternoon. She read the trust, the land east of the city, the company, all of it held for the grandson, vesting on his 25th birthday. Then she read the clause, the one written in by a cautious old man who had buried too many kin gone wrong, and she read it 3 times, and the room with its microfilm hum seemed to tilt very slightly, like a picture knocked crooked. Upon conviction of the beneficiary of any felony offense, the trust shall reverse, and the whole of the corpus shall pass permanently and without condition to Otis Rowe. She looked up the transfer records next. Because greed always files its own confession at the courthouse, it cannot help itself. Title must be recorded. And there it was, dated barely more than a year after the verdict, the whole estate passing from trust to uncle, deed after deed after deed, stamped and notarized in the same season her father had turned 25 inside a prison wood shop. Delia sat in the archive with her hands folded, the way she sat when she was furthest from calm, and understood that she was no longer looking at a corrupted investigation. She was looking at a purchase. Her father's conviction had a buyer. 2 buyers, she corrected herself. A commissioner had bought silence for a son. An uncle had accepted a nephew's life as payment for land. And a dead machinist and a waiting girl on a porch had funded the whole transaction without ever being told. The witnesses came next. Pernell Cobb still lived on the south side, and Delia went to his door on a hot morning in July with her bar card and her careful voice, and got exactly as far as his name. I said what I saw. The door was already closing. That was a lifetime ago. I got nothing for you. Mr. Cobb, I haven't asked you anything yet. And I answered it anyway, he said, and the latch clicked. And through the front window, she watched a heavy old man stand in his hallway with his hand on the wall, like a person steadying himself on the deck of a ship. Letty Grimes was different. Letty Grimes had been waiting, the way Hatch had been waiting, except that what waited in her had teeth. She was old now, and small, in the last house before the curve, a house that had heard that terrible clap through its walls 19 years ago. She looked at Delia's card for a long time on the porch, and then said, "You're the Rowe boy's lawyer," and then said, "Lord, forgive me," and then said, "Come in before I lose my nerve." What she told plainly, with her hands around a glass of tea she never drank. A man had come to see her before the trial. Not the commissioner, no. Smooth voice. He never told her to lie. She wanted that understood. He was too clever to say lie. He told her the family of the poor dead man needed this over quick, and that folks were confused about what they'd seen in the dark, and that the county appreciated people who kept things simple. And then there was a check, which he called consideration for her time. I told the court I saw one set of headlights, Letty said. And that was true, far as it went. But I heard that road, child. I've slept beside that road my whole life. I know it sounds like I know my sister's cough. That night, I heard a vehicle brake and swerve and go on south after the crash, going away fast. And I never said it, because nobody asked me, and I had been paid to keep things simple. Delia asked the only question that mattered. Mrs. Grimes, the check. Do you remember who signed it? The old woman got up without answering and went to a bedroom and came back with a shoebox, because she was of a generation that kept every bank statement God ever mailed them, and she had kept these ones deliberately, in dread and in insurance, for 19 years. I never spent it, she said, not a dollar. I put it in the bank, and I let it sit there like a stone, because I knew one day somebody would stand on my porch. She laid the old statement on the table, and there was the deposit, right in the last days before the trial, and there on the photostat of the check itself, which the bank in those days returned with the statement, was the printed name of Rowe Land and Building Company, and a signature Delia now knew as well as her own. Otis Rowe. Will you put all of it in a sworn statement? Delia asked quietly. The visit, the check, the sound of the vehicle going away south? Child, Letty Grimes said, I have been composing that statement in my head every night for 19 years. Get your pen. One trail remained, and it ran through the county itself. A body shop had swallowed a damaged truck the night of the crash. Body shops die, and this one had years back, but counties never die and never throw anything away. And county money is public money, every dollar of it recorded. Delia spent 2 long evenings with the county's old check registers, public documents, dull as gravel, and in the register for that summer, she found a payment from a county fleet account to a South Side body shop, issued within days of the crash, memo line, fleet repair. Then she pulled the county fleet maintenance logs for the same season, public documents too, and read them twice to be sure. No county vehicle had been in any shop that week. The county had paid for a repair the county never received. Somebody's truck had been fixed with public money quietly, days after a hit and run, in a shop the county did business with, on the authority of an office where a smooth voice worked, and the paper, faithful, patient, incorruptible paper, had kept the receipt for 19 years. She drafted the petition across 4 nights. She built it the way her father built staircases, joint by joint, each document bearing the next one's weight. The evidence log with its buried tag, the notebook, the tow yard's carbon sheet, the visitation record, the will, the clause, the deeds, Letty Grimes, sworn and notarized, the county's own registers contradicting the county's own logs, and at the center of it, a demand. Produce the supplemental forensic report that the evidence log proves was requested, and explain to a court why the defense never saw it. Fay Ridgway read the whole of it on a Friday evening without speaking, the office dark around her one lamp, and when she finished, she took off her glasses and looked at the youngest lawyer in the history of the state for a long moment. "Twice in my life," she said, "I have read a filing and known it would put someone in prison and take someone else out. This is the third." She tapped the signature page. "It's ready. It's more than ready, so file it." "I can't," Delia said, "not yet." Because a lawyer cannot petition for a man who has not asked her to. The last page of the whole beautiful, terrible machine was an authorization, a single line above a printed name, Malaki Rowe, and the line above it was empty, and the only person in the world who could fill it was a quiet man in a prison woodshop who had decided deliberately, the way he measured a cut, that hope was a poison he would never take again. That same evening on the South Side, Pernell Cobb stood in his hallway where he had been standing in one way or another for 19 years and picked up the telephone. His hand shook. He dialed a number he had not dialed in a very long time, and a man past 70 answered in a house that sat on land that had never truly been his. "Otis," Cobb said, "there's a girl." Chapter 8. The glass Otis Rowe did not sleep the night Pernell Cobb called him. He sat in the kitchen of a house built on land that had never truly been his, and he did what he had done for 19 years, which was arrange the story until he could live inside it. A girl lawyer, some non-profit stirring old ashes for attention. Dangerous only if Malachi signed something. And Malachi would not sign anything, Otis reasoned, if Malachi were warned by someone he trusted. There was no one left the man trusted. But there was family, and family opens doors that trust has long since closed. So it happened that on a grey Tuesday morning, before Delia Hartwell had even secured her own visit, a guard came to the woodshop of the Morgan County Correctional Complex and told a quiet man with sawdust on his forearms that he had a visitor, and Malachi Rowe walked to the glass for the first time in years and found his uncle sitting on the other side of it, hat in his hands, old now, eyes down, exactly the way he had sat in a courtroom gallery once. "Look at you," Otis said gently. "You look strong." Malachi said nothing. He had learned that silence was a room a man could live in. "I'll say my piece and go." Otis turned the hat in his hands. "There's a young lawyer sniffing around your case, some outfit in Knoxville. Son, I've seen this before, with businessmen and with convicts both. They come near the end of a man's sentence when he's soft with wanting, and they dangle hope at him, and they raise their money off his name, and when it all falls through they are gone, and he is the one left holding the empty bag. You've got less than 2 years. You've done the hard miracle already. Don't let some child with a briefcase spend your last strength for you. He leaned closer to the glass, and his voice did the thing it had learned from a smoother voice long ago, the thing where concern and threat wear the same coat. Sign nothing, Malachi, for your own sake. Promise your old uncle that. Malachi looked at him for a long moment through the smudged glass, this man who had wept in a parking lot and then taken everything, and what Otis mistook for agreement was only a carpenter measuring rot. You drove a long way, Malachi said, to tell me not to hope. He hung up the phone and went back to the woodshop. But a poison does not need to be believed to work. It only needs to be in the room. And when days later the guard came again and said another visitor, an attorney this time, Malachi walked to the glass with his uncle's warning sitting in his chest exactly where Otis had left it, not trusted, but present, the way damp gets into a joint. The young woman on the other side of the glass was slight, dark-eyed, absurdly young, with a legal pad squared in front of her and her hands folded on it, and something about her stillness disturbed him in a way he could not name and did not try to. Mr. Rowe, my name is Delia Hartwell. I'm an attorney with the Conviction Review Project in Knoxville. I know who you are, he said. You're the one my uncle drove out here to warn me about. First visit that man has made in years. You should be flattered. Delia Hartwell had prepared for this room the way she prepared for everything, and her preparation lasted 4 seconds against the actual sight of him. The booking photograph had shown her a stunned boy. The glass showed her a grey-templed man with her own jaw, her own stillness, her own way of watching, and he was 10 inches away, and she could not tell him, and the phone in her hand weighed more than anything she had ever carried. She laid it out anyway, attorney to client, calm and clean. The evidence log, the notebook, the tow sheet, the witness, the money, the will. She watched it land on him, and what she watched was terrible, because it did not land as joy. It landed as pain. He flinched from the evidence of his own innocence the way a man flinches from heat, and she understood 1 heartbeat too late that Faye's lesson had a third part nobody taught. The truth looks like rescue to the drowning. To a man who has already taught himself to breathe underwater, it looks like drowning again. Stop, he said quietly when she reached the petition. Please. Mr. Rowe, the filing is complete. It needs only your authorization, 1 signature. I know what it needs. His voice never rose. That was the worst of it, that he was gentle. Miss Hartwell, I filed an appeal once. Took 2 years to die. I filed a petition after that. I was sure about that one. I let myself be sure. He looked at his hands, flat on the counter, Carpenter's hands going soft at the knuckles now. When it came back denied, I did not eat for some time. A chaplain sat with me so I wouldn't be alone in what I was thinking. You understand what I am telling you. Yes, she said, because she did. I have less than 2 years left. I can do less than 2 years the way I've done everything, quiet, 1 pew at a time. What I cannot do is hope again and lose again. That will kill me, and it will kill me slower and meaner than this place ever could. He met her eyes through the glass, kind and finished. You seem like a fine young lawyer. Go spend it on somebody who still has a use for it. Sign nothing. That's my answer. There is a species of pain that has no gesture, and Delia Hartwell sat in it perfectly still. Her father was 10 inches and 1 pane of glass and 1 signature away, and he was refusing to be saved, politely, for the sanest reason in the world, and she could break his refusal with 8 words. I am your daughter. He never left you either, and she could not say them, because a revelation through prison glass with guards calling time was not a gift. It was an ambush, and because if he signed for her sake and lost, she would have fed him the poison herself. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Rowe," she said, and her voice held, which was the single greatest performance of her life. He stood and paused, looking at her through the glass with a faint crease of puzzlement, the way you look at a word you can't place. "You remind me of somebody," he said. "I couldn't tell you who." Then he was gone through the grey door, and Delia Hartwell made it to the parking garage and into her car, and got the door closed, and came apart in a way she had never once permitted, at any age, in any room. She had found her father. She had heard his voice, and he had asked her, kindly, to let him finish dying quietly. It was a long time before her hands were still enough to drive. She drove east, not to Knoxville, east, up the dark mountain, because there was one door left, and she had run out of the strength it took to keep it closed. The inn was quiet, the guests long asleep. Her mother was at the kitchen table with the account book, and looked up and put down her pen at the sight of her daughter's face. Delia sat down across from her, in the chair where she had asked the first question of her life, and told her mother everything. The file, the photograph, the crash, the trial bought and paid for, the uncle and the letters and the metal certainty of the will. And the last thing, the thing she had carried alone since a Thursday night in June, the thing she said with her mother's hands gripped in both of hers. "He's alive, Mama. He's 90 minutes from this table. He has been all of it, every dusk you stood on that porch. He's in Morgan County, and he has less than 2 years left. And today I sat across a piece of glass from him, and he refused to let me save him, because he can't survive hoping again." She had imagined her mother weeping. Her mother did not weep. Maren Hartwell sat with the truth of 19 years arriving all at once, the porch, the road, the returned silence, the man who never came because he was never allowed to, and her face did something Delia had never seen it do. The grief went out of it, and what came into it instead had been waiting underneath the grief the whole time, the way bone waits under skin. She stood up. She took the account book off the table and set it aside, and in its place she laid a clean sheet of paper and sat back down and picked up the pen. "He won't sign for a lawyer," Maren said. "Fine." Chapter 9. The Stranger Walks. In the letter reached the Morgan County Correctional Complex on a Thursday, and a guard brought it to the wood shop because the quiet man there never got mail and everyone knew it. Malachi Rowe looked at the envelope for a long time before he touched it. The handwriting had aged 19 years, but a man does not forget the hand that wrote a ledger he signed one June evening with sawdust on his arms. He carried it unopened through the count, through supper, through lights down, and read it finally by the small light every long-timer earns. And it was one page, and it did not accuse anyone of anything, and it did not explain, and it did not beg. It said, "I stood on that porch every dusk for years, and I know now that you were standing somewhere too. You said you would come back with the thing itself and not with words. The girl who came to see you is bringing you the thing itself. All you have to do is what I did. Believe longer than makes sense. M." He read it 11 times. The next morning, he asked the guard, in a voice the guard had never heard him use, how a man went about placing a legal call. Delia drove out that same week with the petition in a leather folder, and the two of them sat where they had sat before, and he looked at her through the glass for a moment before picking up the phone. "You knew her," he said. "All this time you sat here, you knew her. That's who you remind me of." "Sign the last page, Mr. Rowe," Delia said gently, "and ask me again on the other side of this." He signed his name the way he did everything, slowly, carefully, once. The petition was filed in Knox County before the week was out, and the county did what counties do when their own paper is turned against them. It fought. The district attorney's office moved to dismiss the whole thing as too late, years too late, decades too late, a settled matter, and for 9 days the case of Malachi Rowe balanced on the oldest and coldest question in the law, whether truth has an expiration date. Delia's answer ran 14 pages, and its heart was one sentence. A deadline cannot be missed by a man from whom the evidence was hidden, for the clock does not run while the state is sitting on its hands and on its files. The court agreed to hear it, and the court, having read what was attached, did one thing more. It ordered the state to produce from its own archives the complete prosecution file of 2008, including any supplemental forensic reports. The hearing came on a bright, ordinary morning at the end of summer. Word had traveled the way it does. The gallery held Fay Ridgway, and a beekeeping old trooper in his dress uniform, pressed sharp after 19 years in a closet. It held Letty Grimes in her church hat, and a row of reporters who had all, months ago, filmed a swearing-in without knowing what they were filming. It held a quiet woman from Gatlinburg in a blue dress, in the second row, hands folded, watching the side door. And it held, near the back, the daughter of Ollie Brumfield, who had buried her father believing one story about the road and had been telephoned by a young attorney who said, "You deserve to hear the true one," and had come. They brought Malachi Rowe in through the side door, and the room went still. He had left this building young. He came back grey, in an ill-fitting suit, shackled at the waist, and his eyes swept the gallery once, the way a man checks a room out of old habit, and stopped on the second row, and the blue dress, and the face above it. 19 years. He stood absolutely still. A deputy had to touch his elbow to move him to the table. And then the stranger walked in. That is how the reporters wrote it afterward, because that is how it looked. The doors opened, and a young woman came up the aisle alone, slight, dark-eyed, absurdly young, carrying one leather folder, and half the gallery knew her face from the news, and the other half turned to see what the first half was looking at. 18 years old, counsel for the petitioner. She set the folder on the table beside a man she had met twice in her life, and said quietly, so that only he heard it, "Believe longer than makes sense." And Malachi Rowe, who had not wept at his arrest, or his verdict, or his sentencing, gripped the edge of the table. What happened next took less than a morning, after 19 years, and she did it the way her father built staircases, joint by joint, each document bearing the next one's weight. The evidence log first, the state's own ledger, the tag in a schoolteacher hand, possible second vehicle, recommend lab comparison, and beside it, in different ink, administratively closed. Then the trooper. Buford Hatch took the stand in his pressed uniform and laid his notebook flat and testified from it word by word, the 2 sets of tire marks, the crush on the wrong corner, the silver paint sitting too high and running the wrong way, the sober blood draw, and when the state asked him on cross why the court should trust a private notebook over an official report. The old man looked at the prosecutor with 19 years of desk duty in his face and said, "Because I wrote the notebook at the scene with the man's blood still wet, and I don't know who wrote the report, and neither do you." Then the tow yard's carbon sheet faded to the color of weak tea. Then Letty Grimes, small and steady in her church hat, telling about the smooth voice and the check she never spent, and the sound she had kept for 19 years, a vehicle braking, swerving, running away south after the crash. Then the bank photostat with its printed name and its signature, then the will, the clause, the deeds, the visitation log. Then the county's own registers, a repair paid for and never received, laid beside fleet logs that had never heard of it. And then the box the court's own order had pried loose from the state's archive, and inside it, where it had waited under 2 decades of dust, the supplemental forensic report of 2008, describing in the state's own language the foreign paint and the impossible angle, its routing stamp showing the date it reached the prosecution, and no stamp, no entry, no line anywhere showing it was ever served on the defense. The courtroom did not gasp. Real courtrooms rarely do. It did something quieter and more terrible. It stopped rustling. The prosecutor at the state's table read the routing stamp for a long minute and conferred with the older man beside him. And when the judge asked whether the state wished to be heard in opposition, he stood and said the 10 hardest words his office had spoken in living memory. "Your Honor, the state withdraws its opposition to this petition." The judge was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, not long and not loud. He said that the court was vacating the conviction of Malachi Rowe, that the petitioner was to be released without delay, and that the file before him described conduct by public officials and private citizens that the court was formally referring to the Attorney General of Tennessee, naming for the record the handling of the 2008 investigation, the office of a former commissioner, a man named Wade Slocum, and a man named Otis Rowe. He said one thing more. He looked at the daughter of Ollie Brumfield, sitting near the back, and told her that her father was owed a truth as well as a debt, and that the true account of his death would now, at last, be entered in the record of this county, where it should have rested 19 years ago. There was no applause. There was a sound the reporters struggled to describe afterward, the sound of many people exhaling at once, and under it, one low broken note from the second row. The deputies came to unlock the waist chain, and Malachi Rowe's legs would not entirely hold him, and he gripped the table with both Carpenter's hands and stayed upright by will while the shackles came away. He looked at the second row, at the blue dress, and could not yet cross that distance. So he looked instead at the young stranger beside him, this slight girl who had walked into a settled matter and unsettled 19 years of it in a single morning, and asked her the only question left in him, the one the whole gallery leaned toward. "Why?" he said. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Delia Hartwell closed the leather folder. "Walk outside with me," she said, "and I'll answer you." Chapter 10. The Promise. The courthouse steps were loud with reporters, so she took him around to the side, into the shade of the old building, where it was only the two of them and the late summer light. He stood strangely on free ground, the way sailors stand on docks. 19 years teaches a body its distances, and all of his were wrong now, and he kept his hands still at his sides because he did not yet believe he was allowed to want anything. "You said you'd answer me," he said. Delia reached into the leather folder, past the petition and the orders and the vindication, to the thing that had ridden underneath all of it the whole time, and she took out the photograph and put it in his hands. He looked down at it, and the world went away. A young man in a grey work shirt, looking not at the camera but at the girl beside him. A girl looking dead into the lens, chin up, daring the future, stars behind them like something spilled. He had carried this exact minute in the one place he never let himself look, and here it was in his hands, paper after all, the last and kindest paper of the whole long war. "She kept it," he said. His voice had gone somewhere very young. "All this time. How did you come to have—" And then he looked up from the photograph at the face in front of him. He had thought, at the glass, that she reminded him of somebody. He had spent 2 visits failing to place a jaw, a stillness, a way of watching, and now, with the photograph in his hands and the girl before him, the 2 faces arrived in the same heartbeat, hers and his own, and 19 years of arithmetic landed on a man in silence, in the shade of a courthouse, on the first morning of his freedom. Delia watched him understand. She had planned words for this moment, and lost every one of them. "April," he said finally, barely sound at all. "You'd have been born in the April." "The 14th, she said. His knees went, gently, and he sat down right there on the old stone steps of the side entrance, holding the photograph, and she sat down next to him. And for a long while the youngest lawyer in the history of Tennessee and the freest man in it said nothing at all, side by side, careful eyes and careful eyes. "I sat across that glass from you," he said at last, "and told you to spend your hope on somebody who had a use for it. You did. And you let me. You weren't ready. I was raised patient." She looked at him sideways. "You'd have to meet my mother to understand." He laughed, and the laugh broke in the middle and became the other thing, and he wept the way careful men weep, almost silently, his shoulders very still. And when Maren Hartwell came around the corner of the courthouse in her blue dress, having waited as long as any human being could reasonably be asked to wait, she found the two of them sitting on the steps like that, and stopped. Malachi rose. The two of them stood a few feet apart in the shade, 19 years across, and nobody moved, and then he held up the photograph helplessly, as if to say this was as far as I got, and Maren crossed the distance the way she did everything, all at once and without permission, and what they said into each other's shoulders belonged to them and not to this story. He did not move into the inn, that should be told, because it is true to the man. He took a room in Sevierville and a job with a cabinet maker who did not care where a man had spent 19 years, only what his joints looked like, and he came up the mountain on the weekends, and he and Maren sat on the porch in the evenings and learned each other again slowly, the way you restore old wood, no stripping, no hurry, coat by patient coat. Some silences on that porch were griefs. More and more of them were not. The state, in time, would pay him for the years, the way the law provides, and other courtrooms would open for other men, Otis and Wade and the smooth-voiced office, and Delia would be in those rooms too. But that is winter's story. This one ends in the fall. Because in October, on the porch where he had once promised to return in 1 month, Malachi Rowe kept the promise, 19 years and some months late. He did not kneel. His knees had earned their exemptions. He stood in front of Maren Hartwell with a small box from a jeweler in Knoxville, bought with the first money he had ever earned as a free man, and said, "I told you once I'd come back with the thing itself. I apologize for the delay." She said what she had decided on a porch 19 years ago. Their daughter planned all of it. She planned it the way she prepared a filing, joint by joint, nothing left to luck. She strung the inn's porch with small lights for the supper. She chose the flowers, mountain flowers, nothing that had to be shipped in. She drove the licenses and the paperwork herself, because paper was her country, and this was the one document of her career she intended to frame. And for the ceremony itself, she chose the only place it could ever have been. They married at dusk at Newfound Gap in October, when the crowds go home early and the light goes long and gold before it goes. A minister from Gatlinburg, a handful of chairs, Fay Ridgway in the front row beside a retired trooper in his dress uniform, and Letty Grimes in her church hat, and the towyard's daughter, and the cabinet maker, and the innkeeper's neighbors who had watched a woman watch a road for 19 years. Maren wore no veil. She had spent enough of her life with things between her and his face. They stood against the low stone wall while the color drained west, and said the words, and the cold, clean dark came up out of the valleys, the way it had come up on a June night long ago, and then, above the spine of the Smokies, the stars came out, not politely, like something spilled. Delia stood up front the whole time, holding the ring until it was needed, and when it went onto her mother's hand at last, 19 years late and right on time, she looked at her father's face and found him looking not at the ring and not at the sky, but at her mother, exactly the way the old wound camera had caught him looking once, as if no time had passed, as if all of it had. Afterward, when the small crowd had eaten and laughed and gone down the mountain, the three of them stayed at the wall a while in the dark. Delia took out her phone. "Stand there," she said. Both of you. You know how. They knew how. His arm went around her mother. The wind pushed her mother's hair sideways, and just before Delia pressed the shutter, she said something that made them both laugh. And that is the instant she caught. And then she turned the camera and stepped into the frame herself and caught the three of them together under all that spilled sky. The first photograph of her whole life in which everyone she came from was present and free and looking at the light. 2 pictures now lived in the cedar box, which was never locked again. A boy had made a promise on that mountain. A man had kept it. And the proof, as always, was in the paper.